So I think we're going to get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dorothy Guzzo, the Executive Director of the New Jersey Historic Trust. I'm happy to see such interest in the upcoming grant program. For those of you who may not know, this is actually a webinar. You might be familiar with Zoom, but webinars are a little different. If you're seeing me over top of your of the slide, you can go up to the top of your screen to view options and click on side by side, and that should move who's ever talking off to the right so that you can have a full view of the slide. I can't see any of you, but I know that you're there. So we're going to get started. So for those of you who might be attending for the first time, the Historic Trust is the entity in New Jersey that's charged with administering the planning and capital and heritage tourism grant programs. You can go to the next slide, please. Our board is appointed by the governor, and they meet quarterly to focus on the grant program and also on the larger needs of the historic preservation community in the state. Our funding comes from the corporate business tax dedication that was approved by the voters in 2014. The funding goes to open space, farmland, and historic preservation. This year, and for this grant round, we announced the availability of $10 million, which we're hoping to award in 2021. The pandemic and the resultant loss in business revenue may impact that number, but we're not going to know that for a very long time to come. So next slide, please. A little bit about our process. Our grant deadline is 4 p.m. on April 29th. It's an important date and time for you to remember. And that's for everything, the application and the flash drives that contain all of your attachments. If you are a repeat grant applicant, I just want to mention that last year we made a lot of exceptions because of the pandemic and all of the unanticipated conditions we were working with and faced with. But, and this is an extremely important but, we won't be making these allowances this year. The staff are going to go over our cure process, but please keep in mind that what you submit this year is what we're going to evaluate. So please, please do your planning up front before you sit down to type out your application. The trust engages experts from outside the state to evaluate and rank our applications. And that is so we can keep and incorporate as much objectivity as possible. Keep in mind that our evaluators only know what you've told them in the application and what you show them in photos. From them, a recommendation is made by our Grants and Loans Committee to the full board. Right now, we anticipate that the full board will meet at the end of September. And their approval is transmitted to the Garden State Preservation Trust, another governor-appointed board with oversight for all three of these programs, for their review and approval. And from there, the recommendations are turned into a piece of legislation which has to be passed in both the houses before the governor can sign the actual appropriations bill. So it's almost a year-long process from the time you submit your application till we're ready to begin. One thing I wanted to mention, I noted on the registration list for this afternoon that there are several religious organizations joining us today. I just needed to remind everyone that the New Jersey Supreme Court rendered a decision in 2018 that it was against the state's constitution to spend public monies on the maintenance or construction of houses of worship. So we are no longer able to fund even the exterior of houses of worship. As you might imagine, with any legal decision, there are nuances. No nonprofit organization is barred from applying, but it's the project itself which may not be fundable with our program. If you think you are proposing something related but not a project specific to the house of worship itself, give us a call to discuss before submitting your application. While this decision was appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court in 2019, they declined to take the case, as I understand it, because there wasn't any case law about how it was being applied. But having said all that, please feel free to reach out if you do have questions about your project. Next slide, please. This afternoon, you'll be hearing from the trust staff on how to prepare an application and to explain what's new for this year. And although we are mostly working remotely, the staff is available to help you and answer any questions you have as you work on your application. So I'm going to turn this over to Haley Galpin, who will explain the format for today's workshop. Thank you, everybody, and I'll probably catch up with you at the end of this presentation.
All right. Hi there, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. My name is Haley McAlpine. I am a Senior Historic Preservation Specialist with the Trust, and I'm going to kick things off today by going over the webinar format and the agenda for today. Next slide, please. Thank you. Okay, so first up, as Dorothy mentioned, we are recording this webinar. We can't see your beautiful faces, but you will be able to see us and hear us and see the presentation as well in the recording. It will be posted to the Trust website probably by the end of next week. So if you have questions or you need to look back to reference things, it will be available for you. We are offering a Q&A, so we'll offer a Q&A at the end of each section that we present, and we will also offer a Q&A at the end of the presentation in case we have any other questions that come up. All of your questions should be submitted through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen, you'll see the Q&A button. You can click there and type your questions right into the chat. Some of your questions may be too project specific for us to answer them today in this venue. If that's the case, Carrie Hogan, our fiscal officer, she's going to be monitoring the chat. She may refer you to the NJHT email address. If you could go ahead and send your project specific question there, we will forward it to the appropriate program officer and they'll get in touch with you to help you get to the bottom of your question. Also, we ask that you all please stay until the very end. I know it's a long workshop. We're going to go through a ton of material today and not all of it will be applicable to you. But we do save the application attachments for the end and it's super important. It's basically half of your application is attachments. So it's really important that you learn about that. And then we're also going to give you some tips and tricks on how to set your application apart this year. So you definitely want to stick around. So with that being said, the agenda for today, I will get us going by giving you a brief overview of the grant guidelines. And then we're actually going to go through the applications for each of the grant types specifically and dig in a lot more detail. So while I'll give you a kind of a general idea, a lot of your detailed questions will be answered in these overviews. So we will start with historic site management, then move to heritage tourism, and finally our capital grant program. After that, we'll review the application attachments for all three grant types. We will give you those tips on how to set your application apart, and then we'll offer one final Q&A round to address any questions that may have come up throughout the presentation. So next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and jump right in and give you a quick overview of the grant guidelines for this year's grant round. All right, so we wanted to start by calling your attention to some things that are new and notable for this year. First up are the municipal planning projects. So this is a new category of fundable activities within the historic site management grant program. So it's not a separate grant application. If you do want to pursue one of these projects, you're going to use a normal historic site management grant application, but there's going to be some new questions for you. And these municipal planning projects, we call them MPPs for short. They include preparation of design guidelines, local preservation ordinances, components of your master plan, and architectural surveys. Glenn's going to get into these in a little more detail in a few minutes. So just calling your attention. Next up, we are offering our multi-phase capital funding commitments again this year. This is our third year offering them. They've been pretty successful. These are opportunities for funding for large-scale capital projects. So you have to be applying for at least $500,000 and your project has to have at least 2 phases of work. So Erin will get into that in a little bit in more detail. Next up, we have 2 special initiatives for the 2021 grant round. The first is the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution, and the second is what we're calling underrepresented histories. And in a minute, I will give you a little bit more information about those. Next, so we know that this pandemic has kind of turned our world on its head, and we want to give you an opportunity to address how it's impacted your organization and your resource within the application. So you'll see 2 new questions, one in the organizational ability section and one in public benefit. The organizational ability section asks you how the pandemic impacted your applicant organization. So maybe that's staffing or funding, maybe your priorities have shifted. So we'd like to know how the pandemic has impacted the applicant. Next is public benefit. So that's where we're going to ask you how the pandemic has impacted your resource. So we know that most of our historic resources have had to close or are maybe still closed due to the COVID restrictions or staffing limitations. So we know that things have changed quite a bit, and we are interested to know what has changed in your world. Another note about the pandemic is that we do ask for your open hours and your annual visitation rates. We know that 2020 is not indicative of those normal numbers. So we're going to ask you to supply us with your pre-pandemic visitation data. in that public benefit section. And then finally, just to reiterate what Dorothy reminded us at the beginning, is that no information submitted after the grant deadline will be accepted or reviewed. There are a couple of exceptions. Board resolution, I'm sorry, got my cat here. He's a ham for the camera. Board resolutions, we know that sometimes your boards meet only quarterly or maybe twice a year. So we know that those might come in during the summer. But please make sure you do get them on the agenda as soon as you can. We don't want you to miss what we have an August 2nd cure deadline. So everything that might be accepted after the deadline would have to be received by August 2nd. And that also includes certificates of eligibility. So there's a couple of things that we will accept, things we won't accept, changes to your scope, changes to your budget, new proposals from consultants, resumes, letters of support that were solicited after the grant deadline. As Dorothy said, we were pretty flexible last year because our grant round coincided with kind of the height of the spring and the summer peaks of the pandemic. So we knew we were in a unique situation, but this year we're taking a pretty firm line. So when your application is submitted, make sure it's complete, double check your numbers, double check your attachments, because what you submit is what we'll evaluate. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so as promised, I'm going to dig in a little bit into our 2021 special initiatives and how you can demonstrate that you're participating in them. Just a note, you don't have to be participating in either initiative to apply. It's just kind of a bonus point if your project can demonstrate that you're participating in one or both of these. So up first is the semi-quincentennial, also known as the semi-quin or the 250th. So that anniversary is coming up in 2026, which sounds so far away, but it will be here before you know it. And we know that a lot of New Jersey sites have a strong connection to the American Revolution. So ways you can show you're participating, maybe your site is gearing up to be visitor ready for the 250th. Maybe you're rolling out new exhibits or new interpretation. So you'll have an opportunity in the application to explain how you're actually participating in the semi-quincentennial. Up next is the Underrepresented Histories Special Initiative. So this is new this year. And so in response to the nation's recent reckoning with racial injustice and keeping in line with the state's historic preservation plan, the Trust is seeking to expand representation of marginalized groups and also empower meaningful involvement of minority constituencies in the identification, preservation, and interpretation of our historic resources. So for the 2021 round, we are encouraging applications that demonstrate efforts or initiatives that consider underrepresented histories. So this could be Black history, civil rights history, disability history, Indigenous history, Latinx history, LGBTQ plus history, or really any history of any other marginalized group. So there are a few ways that you can participate in this initiative or demonstrate to us that you're participating. The first is through capital investment. So that's bricks and mortar preservation of a resource that has a connection with an underrepresented history, or maybe a newly uncovered connection with an underrepresented history. The second is through identification and evaluation of historic resources. So this could be a National Register nomination for a site that has a connection to underrepresented history, or maybe a revision to an existing National Register nomination that works to include and uncover stories that have maybe previously been excluded from the historical narrative. The third avenue is through interpretation. So same with the semi-quin, if you're rolling out new interpretation or you're revisiting your existing interpretation of your site to include more underrepresented histories, that's a great opportunity to let us know that you're really working to include those stories in your interpretation for the people who visit your site. And same with exhibiting and programming. You have a lot of opportunities to include those underrepresented histories in new exhibits or program offerings. And there's a chance that those may align with our Heritage Tourism Grant Program. So we have this beautiful fact sheet. It is available on our website. It's also linked directly in your grant applications. And our historic preservation specialist, Sam Siegel, has really led the charge on this. He's kind of our point person. So if you do have specific questions, we'll ask you to reach out to him in particular, or we'll direct you to him about the Underrepresented Histories Initiative. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so this is our third year with our online application. It has been going really well, and we want to keep that success rate going by giving you a couple of tips for navigating the online application. First, I'd like to say that you are required to use it. You do have to submit your application through the online portal. It's hosted on a website called FormSite. It's really easy to use. When you click on the link to the online application, you'll see this instruction page here. Down at the bottom is that big blue bar that says Save and Return. You'll click there to make your account. For every grant application that you start, you need a new login. So some of you may be pursuing more than one application this year. You're going to need a different login for each application. It's not like Sage where you log in and you get access to all of them at once. Each application needs its own login. Also, we don't have access to your login information. It's a privacy thing. So if you lose your password, you actually have to contact FormSite to get it. So please write those down, keep them somewhere safe, keep track of that information because our hands are tied in some of the ways that we could help you with it. So while we have the online application, we also have all of the questions available in both PDF and Word doc versions. Those are also linked on our website. So we find the best way for you guys to do this is to read through the application first on a Word doc or PDF and actually type your answers into the Word document offline and then copy paste into the online form. You'll get a chance to see how many characters are allowed for each answer. You'll get to see all of the questions at once, whereas on FormSite, you have to complete each page before you can go to the next one. And then also this helps get away from any loss of data issues. You know, God forbid you just finished answering a really intense question on FormSite and your computer crashes, maybe it doesn't save. FormSite's pretty good about saving as you go, but it's not guaranteed. So please type your answers offline. And then you can also save a copy of that offline application for your files so that you have all of your answers there for you if you need to look back at what you submitted. Next, please familiarize yourself with the attachments checklist for your grant type. Each grant type has a different attachments checklist. It's available on our website. It's included in your application, and there's also a link to just the checklist itself. So you'll be able to see all the things you're required to submit, one of which is a governing body resolution. Take a look at your board meeting schedule now. Make sure you get it on the agenda. You don't want to end up at a meeting with a very full agenda and the clerk bumps you to the next meeting, and before you know it, you miss our deadline. So please be planning ahead for those board resolutions, very important. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, eligible applicants for the Preserve New Jersey grant program. These include agencies of government, so that's county, municipal, or state, as well as 501c nonprofit organizations that can demonstrate compliance with New Jersey charitable registration laws. We do have a couple of ownership requirements, and my colleagues are going to get into these in a lot more depth, but for our historic site management and heritage tourism grants, if the applicant does not own the resource, you do have to have owner consent. They'll have to sign a form that we call the owner assurances form, and you'll submit that with your application. For capital grants, it's a little bit, there's a little bit more information we'd need. If the applicant does not own the resource, they have to have a lease agreement in place with at least 15 years remaining on the lease. And it should authorize you to make capital repairs to the building. If you don't have the lease, you might be able to pursue an owner authorization form, but there are some limits on that Erin's going to dig into in a few minutes, to keep that in mind. And in addition to the lease, they will have to also sign the owner assurances form. So like I said, we'll have a little more detail coming up, but just a preview of the ownership requirements. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, properties that are eligible for our funding. So those include sites that are listed individually in the state or the National Register of Historic Places. It includes sites that are listed as contributing resources to historic districts that are listed in the state or the National Register. So if you are applying in your resources within a historic district, please take a look at your National Register nomination and make sure that it lists your property specifically as a contributing resource. If it doesn't, you're going to have to reach out to the Historic Preservation Office and get a letter from them certifying that you are indeed a contributing resource to the district. And then finally, the last eligible property are those that are determined eligible for listing in the New Jersey or National Registers. Basically, that means that the Historic Preservation Office has reviewed the property and determined that it could be listed, and they will issue you what we call a certificate of eligibility, a COE. And that is one of those few documents that we will accept after the grant deadline because we know it can take them some time. We do have to have them by August 2nd of this year, or we cannot consider you for funding. Also, like I said, it takes time. So if you do have to pursue a COE, please start that immediately. Reach out to the Historic Preservation Office, get that application process going. There may be a little bit of a back and forth. So we want to give the Historic Preservation Office as much time as we can to get those in place. And just a note, while a COE is enough for a historic site management or a heritage tourism grant, for those of you pursuing a capital grant, you do actually have to be listed in the state register before we can reimburse you any funds. So the COE will get you through the application process, but to get that first check in the mail, your site does have to be listed. So, okay, next slide, please. So for all three of our grant programs, we use 4 main categories of criteria when we review and evaluate your application. So the first is the historic significance of the resource. We look at how your property is listed. Is it in the New Jersey Register, the National Register? Is it a National Historic Landmark? We need to make sure that it's contributing to a historic district if it's within one. And like I said, you have to have those COEs to us by August 2nd. We also take into account any threat to the property. So maybe it's in danger of imminent collapse. Maybe it's on a list slated for demolition because it's deemed a public hazard. Maybe you have a developer in your community that has their eye on your property and would like to see condos there instead of a historic resource. So you'll have an opportunity in your application to explain any potential threats to your site. And that's a big part of how we score our applications. So make sure you give that your all. The next section is project concept and team. So that's where we're going to take a close look at the actual project you're proposing in your grant application. We'll be asking questions like, is your scope of work clear and understandable? Is it appropriate for your resource? So if you're applying for Heritage Tourism Grant for wayfinding signs, but your roof is caving in, we may say, hey, your priorities here aren't quite in line, and let's take care of the roof before we put signs in. We also look at your project team. So some of you may be applying with a consultant already in mind. You'll be providing proposals from them and resumes. We're going to be taking a close look to make sure that they meet our professional qualification standards. For some of our municipal applicants, you may not be applying with a project team in mind. You'll want to supply an RFP or a draft RFP, and it's really important that you clearly delineate the professional qualifications for anyone that would work on the project. So it's really important from a scoring perspective that you include the professional qualifications in the RFP or draft RFP. In this section, we also look at your budget. Is it realistic? And your project schedule. Is it feasible? Okay, next slide. So the third category is organizational ability. And here we're talking about the applicant organization. So we want to know if you've been a good steward to the property. Do you have a long-term commitment to the preservation of the resource? Do you have your matching funds in hand? Maybe you only have a portion of your matching funds, but you have an excellent track record as fundraisers. So we want to make sure we know if you're confident that you can raise all the money. And then finally, we take a look at public benefit. So how would our investment in your project benefit your community and how they engage with your historic resource? Is it an innovative project? Are you going to expand your reach to new audiences? Does it complement state initiatives? Does it complement our special initiatives? Is there documented community support? You're going to hear this throughout, but those letters of support are so incredibly important. Our evaluator panel has told us the last few years that letters of support are at times can be a make or break. You know, it's kind of the human interest piece of your application. So it's really, really important that you get strong letters of support and you get those before the grant deadline and submit them with your application. And finally, we do take into account geographic distribution. The trust is very cognizant of spreading our money across the state. So we don't want to fund just South Jersey or North Jersey or the contested Central Jersey. I believe in you. Many people don't, but we are aware that we are spreading our money across the state and across different counties as well. So at times that may come up in the grant evaluation just to make sure that we are hitting the whole state. Okay. So archaeology requirements. Archaeology is super important to the trust. We don't want this to be an afterthought. So for our planning projects, we recommend you include an archaeological management plan, an AMP, if you don't already have one. If you're pursuing a preservation plan or an HSR, archaeology should absolutely be included in any planning document that we fund. From a capital perspective, if your project has any degree of ground disturbance at all, whether you're excavating a foundation or digging a utility trench, you have to have an archaeologist involved. The level of archaeological intervention will be on a case-by-case basis. It's site specific, but it's absolutely something we will ask you about on our site visit. So make sure you've got good answers to those questions and that you're including it with your project and it's not an afterthought. Okay. So before I turn it over to my colleagues, I just want to run down the different grant types we're offering for the 2021 grant round. So up first are our historic site management grants, HSMs. These are planning grants. They don't fund any capital work, so it's just a planning exercise. The awards run between $5,000 and $50,000. And the trust would provide a 75% match. So we pay 75% of the project total up to $50,000, you would pay 25%. Our heritage tourism planning grants have the same criteria, 5,000 to 50,000, and it's that same 75 to 25 ratio. The trust pays 75%, you pay 25. And then we offer capital grants. So we break our capital grants into a couple different categories here. Capital level 1 are our smaller capital grants. The awards range from $5,000 to $150,000, and the trust would provide 60% of the total project cost, and the applicant would provide 40%. The capital level 2 grants run from $150,001 to $750,000, and that's a one-to-one match. So we pay 50%, you pay 50%. And then we have those capital multi-phase grants that I mentioned earlier. Those are from $500,000 to $750,000 per phase. There must be at least 2 phases, and that's that same one-to-one match. We pay 50%, you pay 50%. So before we dig into historic site management, I just wanted to take a minute to check in with the Q&A and see if there's any questions that I can answer before we move on.
Yeah, we have a couple of good questions in the Q&A. We're going to start off with one that I think is for Dorothy. Dorothy, if you want to come back on. We have a question regarding, from Dennison Harold. We have a question regarding what other options might be available for funding since the decision of 2018 for churches.
Yeah, so that's a tough one. You could try the Partners for Sacred Places out of Philadelphia to see if there's any grant money in there. There's sometimes the National Trust for Historic Preservation offers some grant programs that are a little different each year. So that would be another place to check, particularly, so I think I'm familiar with your resource, your church. So particularly for your significance, you might fall into one of their other categories, if not specifically for church, but maybe under a different theme for them. But other than that, I am unaware of other sources of funding for churches, but it is a very good question and something that is worth pursuing in terms of trying to make up for the loss of the funds in New Jersey, or the loss of the funding opportunity here in New Jersey. So it's a partial answer, sorry.
Okay, Sam Stevens asks, is it possible to apply for both a capital grant and a heritage tourism grant in the same grant round?
Yep, that's a great question. So you can absolutely apply for more than one grant type in the same round. It's important to note the way that we evaluate grants. So historic site management and heritage tourism are evaluated together and capital is evaluated separately. So if you were to apply for heritage tourism and capital, those two applications would not be in direct competition with one another. However, if you were to apply for 2 capital grants, those 2 would be going up against each other for the same pot of money. But yes, absolutely, you can submit more than one grant application. Just keep in mind, you're going to have to make a separate login on FormSite.
Great. Allison asks, can municipal planning projects include preservation plans for historic cemeteries?
So that would actually just be a normal historic site management project. So it wouldn't necessarily be a municipal planning project, even if the municipality is applying. That would fit into more of our traditional historic site management. So the municipal planning projects are projects that have kind of a much larger reach that spread across a municipality or multiple municipalities, and they're from kind of the municipal level of planning. A preservation plan for a cemetery would be a great fit for just a regular HSM activity.
Great, great. Dante says that his property has a COE, a certificate of eligibility with HPO, that is 25 years old. Is that okay?
We're going to ask you to revisit that with HPO. I mean, a lot can change in 25 years, and part of the way they determine eligibility is the amount of historic fabric or integrity left on the resource. So there's a potential for a lot to have changed in 25 years. So we would ask that you please reach out to HPO and get a new COE.
Great. Janice asks, do archaeological requirements apply to dirt basements of historic structures?
Yes.
Great. Let's see, we've got lots of questions rolling in now. Okay, here's a good one. If a property changed owners, would a new national registration be needed, or would the other form be acceptable?
The original form is still acceptable.
Right. Okay.
Definitely.
Okay. Governing body resolution. Does this mean that you want a copy of minutes of the board meeting showing the approval to have the work done? No.
No, we just need the resolution signed and submitted, ideally by the grant deadline. However, like I said, that's one of the few documents we would allow to come in over the summer, but absolutely no later than August 2nd. So just the resolution is sufficient. Okay.
And then Patty asks, if the facility is a contributing resource to the historic district, do we need a certificate?
So take a peek at your nomination. Some of the older nominations are pretty vague and they don't list the individual resource. Some of the more contemporary nominations are great and they'll actually give you a list of addresses or a list of named buildings as contributing. So if your nomination specifically identifies your resource as contributing, you do not need a COE. If you have the misfortune of having one of those more vague nominations, you are going to have to reach out to HPO and get, it's the same kind of COE. I think they call it a COE 2, but it's the same idea that they're going to certify that you are contributing. So just take a peek at your nomination before you go that route.
That's good advice for any of you that are aware that you have a COE. Just take a look at it again. Look at your nomination if you already have one as well. Okay, so then this one's for Sam, and I think he's going to cover this later, but identification of underrepresented histories, is this primarily for research with existing, already identified historic districts?
So Sam, I'll let you take that one.
Sure. It's a great question. I think, this is the first year that we're offering this special initiative, and our goal is to be as comprehensive as possible in the support that we provide. So I would say, you shouldn't hesitate to apply, regardless of whether you're working with a new site or an established site.
Okay. And then we have a couple of questions that seem pretty project specific. So we're going to answer those individually. And unless you guys see something that I don't, that you think needs to be answered here. Yeah, I think we're going to move on. So we can move on to the next section and I'll work on answering these questions offline.
Okay, great. So Glenn Saponis is up next and he's going to go through the Historic Site Management Grant Program.
Hello, everyone. Again, my name is Glenn Saponis, and I'm going to touch on both the Historic Site Management Grant as well as Heritage Tourism Grant applications. Both are considered planning grants, not to be confused again with our construction or capital grants, which Aaron will talk about in a little bit. First part of my presentation, I'm going to kind of do a little overview stuff similar to what Haley was going over with regards to both HSM and Heritage Tourism applications. So eligible activities under the planning grant, the HSM grant, could be basically anything that's going to help lead to guide a future current or future project at your site, whether it's construction documents and specifications, preservation plans and historic structure reports, feasibility studies, structural evaluation, again, all important archaeological study and reports, the preparation of nominations to both the National Register and historic places. Again, if you only have a COE and you might be coming to, looking forward to us for perhaps a capital grant, perhaps now's the time to actually get a HSM grant in order to actually have your nomination prepared. Also, it'll cover master plans, strategic plans, landscape, historic landscape plans. Again, those municipal planning projects that Haley mentioned. This is just a partial list. Go to our grant guidelines so that you can see a more complete list. But again, if you don't see something on there that you're thinking about, reach out to one of the staff people at the trust and we'll discuss it with you to see if it's an eligible exercise or not. But again, basically, these are all types of projects that will help guide future projects at your site. Next, please. Again, as Haley mentioned, the kind of new are municipal planning projects or MPPs. Again, these, for the most part, take care of architectural surveys to identify historic properties, perhaps in a larger type area, the creation of design guidelines, preparation or revisions of local historic preservation ordinances, as well as preservation components of a municipal master plan. If you are looking to do an architectural survey to identify historic properties, this survey should comply with all Historic Preservation Office guidelines. We provide a link to these guidelines in the application. And if you're looking to prepare or revise a local historic preservation ordinance, again, you should go to the HPO. We have a link to their CLG guidelines, the Certified Local Government Guidelines, which talk about the preparation of preservation ordinances. So again, if you're going after either of these, that they should reference and be in compliance with the HPO guidelines. Now we offered these MPP projects last year, but this year we did add some specific questions to the application specific to this type of project to make sure. So make sure that you find that your project as an MPP. That way, as you go through the application, appropriate questions will pop up that are only applicable to MPP projects. And the certain ones won't be applicable to you. So again, make sure that when they ask what kind of project this is, that if it is an MPP, that you make that checkbox. Also, as I said, if there is a specific activity you're thinking about, but it's not on this list or the broader list for preservation planning projects, call the trust and we could discuss to make sure it's an eligible project before you get too far into this. Next, please. Again, just generally speaking, I'll go into some of this a little bit more detail, but with planning grants and heritage tourism grants, they are matching grants. It's a 3-to-1 funding match. Again, as Haley mentioned, that means we provide 75% of the project funding while you provide 25% of the funding. Now, having match in hand is not necessarily a requirement to apply, but again, the more match you have in hand at the time of application or during the process, or providing us with a solid plan on how you're going to raise those additional funds if you don't have it in hand, makes for a stronger application. So while it's not required to have full match in hand, laying out a game plan in order to acquire that is important within your application. Next, please. Again, with some more kind of general requirements regarding planning and heritage tourism grants. Again, owner consent signature is required if you, as the applicant, does not own or lease the property. And if the project is for a historic district nomination, a historic preservation ordinance, or the architectural survey, and owner assurances must be signed by the head of each municipality in which that project falls in. You don't need individual signatures from every property owner, but we want to make sure that whatever governing body, well, if it's a county-wide survey, that the head county official is signing off on it, that they approve this going forward. If it's a historic district within your local municipality, then having the mayor or whoever is head of that municipality sign off on the owner assurances form. With all HSM and heritage tourism projects, the work must be completed within 2 years after the funds are appropriated. So it's not when you apply, it's not when we notify you, it's when that legislation that Dorothy talked about actually goes through and the governor signs it. That's when the clock starts ticking for the 2 years that you need to finish your approved work There's an additional year given in order to close out the grant, but the work should be done within 2 years of that notification. With all of these, grantees should acknowledge funding assistance and published materials, whether it's a preservation plan, if it's something on your website, if it's signage, you should acknowledge the funding source from the Preserve New Jersey Fund. And again, submission of New Jersey historic places nominations is always strongly encouraged as a project goal. It's the more resources that are listed, it does provide some additional protections to those sites, especially if it's municipally related to a municipally owned property. Now, if your resource is not currently listed, again, if we strongly encourage that you try to do that. And again, important, because if you're coming to us in the future for a capital grant, it needs to be actually listed before we could give you capital funds. But also keep in mind that National Register nominations, state register nominations are eligible activity under HSM grants. So utilize our money to get that done. Next, please. So now I want to kind of go over the actual applications. The application for both HSM and Heritage Tourism grants are very similar, probably 95% the same. So if you're applying for a Heritage Tourism grant, please pay attention to this part of the presentation as well. I will discuss some of those unique items that apply only to Heritage Tourism applications near the end of my presentation. The other thing I want to point out, I guess now, since we're getting into the actual application, is that throughout the application, we've included basically additional guidance explaining what we're looking for in certain questions, what we're looking for in some of the answers, and where to find, again, links to perhaps a HPO guidelines or something like that. So keep your eyes open for those helpers. Also, at the end of each section in the application, there's a checklist of items that are required in the attachment section. Again, Sam's going to go over the attachments at the end. But again, at the end of each section, we give you a checklist on what needs to be included. So again, that helps guide you through compiling the information that you need for this application. So the application itself has basically five sections. There's and again, as Haley mentioned, they correspond to the evaluation criteria, 4 criteria, but there's also some basically kind of upfront material too. But it's the property information and historic significance. It's the project concept and team, the overall project budget, the organizational ability, as well as the public access and benefit aspect of the application. Next, please. So with HSM and Heritage Tourism applications, the first part of the application is basically it's an overview, it's a summary. It asks for the project title, such as Preservation Plan for Historic Schoolhouse. It asks for a brief summary of what the project is, again, in a few words, just say what the project is, what the final product is going to be. And then it asks also for basically the grant request amount as well as the total project cost. Again, this is at this point just a summary. You'll be able to get in, there'll be questions that kind of get into detail of both what the project is as well as the project budget. Gets into more detail as we go through the application. But this first section is basically a summary, one-stop shop, so we kind of get a big quick picture of what you want to do and how much you're asking for and what the total project cost is. Next, please. The next part of the application, or continue on with the application, we look for applicant information. You as the applicant, your organization, a project contact. Again, this project contact needs to be someone who's familiar with the project and also is accessible. If we have a question about the application, we need someone we could get in touch with, someone who's going to return our calls. If we're trying to schedule a site visit, again, someone who we could get in contact with, and again, who knows the project. So that should be the person as the project contact. For all nonprofits who are applying, you need to provide an IRS letter to document tax exempt status. That'll go in the attachment A, but you could also go to the IRS. You should also go to the IRS website for nonprofits. You could look up your organization, make sure that they still have you as current, and you can actually print out that page that says you are currently registered as a nonprofit with the IRS, and include that within your application as well. Now, we also look for your current charitable registration number. This is a New Jersey charitable registration number. It's obtained through the Division of Consumer Affairs, Charities Registration. Again, I recommend that if you don't know your number, but even if you do, you should go look it up, make sure you are still considered current, because we're going to be doing the same. So it's good to start taking care of that now. If for some reason you're no longer listed as being current, you missed a year providing information and you got dropped, or if there's some sort of issue, now's the time to start taking care of that. And if you're not currently listed, again, you could go through the process of making sure that your organization is listed. Again, that's for nonprofits. Nonprofits also need to provide us with a governing board resolution. Again, this resolution is basically authorizing most likely a project contact to actually apply. We want to make sure that the organization is aware that someone is applying for a grant on behalf of that organization. So that's why we require a governing board resolution, basically authorizing this person to sign applicant assurances as well as to apply for the grant itself. If you're a government agency, you also need a resolution, basically authorizing for the application itself, as well as acknowledging that you will have matching funds if you do receive the grant in the future. All right, next slide, please. So the next section focuses on the property and its significance. Again, one of those categories that we had mentioned earlier. So historic property name, again, we're looking for the historic name associated with the property. Typically, again, you'll get this off of the National Register nomination or the certificate of eligibility. If the application is for more than one property, or again, for one of those MPP projects, you'll choose a relevant property or a reference property that is listed as being eligible, either listed or as eligible. Other properties, again, if it's for a district, whatever, you could list those other properties somewhere else in the application, but for the purpose of this section of the application, list a reference property. Again, we're asking within the application to tell us the current status of the property. Is it listed on the National State Register? Is it individual or part of a district? And again, is it certified eligible? Do you have a determination of eligibility or certificate of eligibility? Then we ask for actually specific information on the historic significance of the property, the date built, architectural style, builder. You know, we ask you how it is significant and why it's important to preserve. We ask you about its history of use, both historically, currently, and perhaps your project has long-term to use it in a different way, so you can propose use as well. We're also asking you about current condition. Is it occupied, unoccupied? What's the overall general condition of it? And as Haley mentioned earlier, any threat to the resource. And again, that could be anything from its current condition, having structural issues, or because there's some development pressure surrounding the property that provides this overall threat. I think also, I guess, keep in mind as you're especially when it comes to the narrative questions within the application, keep in mind, again, and Dorothy mentioned this earlier, that, and I think Haley did as well, that the evaluators are only see your application. They're not going to be coming out to your site. They're not going to be talking to you. So their evaluation is truly fully based on the information within your application. So make sure it is complete, thorough, but also concise. You know, the reviewers are reading a lot of applications. So the best effort you can make at making sure that your point comes through clearly and easily, again, the stronger your application becomes. Next slide, please. So the next section deals with the project concept and team. Here we're asking you to kind of outline the goals for the project. You know, what is this project, this product that you're applying for? How's it going to be used for future activity? Is it a preservation plan that might, or condition assessment that might help a future construction project? Is it actual construction documents that'll go towards a construction document? Whatever it is, we're asking you to in a narrative form again to explain what future activity that the goal of this project is. Also, if it's going to address particular problems or needs that at the site that you're currently having. Also, we're asking you to list proposed consultants. Again, more detail regarding credentials and resumes and all will come in attachment D in the attachment section. But at this point, we're asking you just to list out the proposed consultants. Again, if you don't currently at the time that you finish your application, if you don't have someone on board or a list of people or proposals from consultants, at least provide, and again, hopefully this is in the RFP, what you're looking for in that consultant, what that consultant needs to provide within this project, so that again, as we're reading through this and trying to evaluate it, we know, again, is this the right type of consultant for your project, and is this the right project for your particular resource? We're also asking you in this part of the application to go over timetable and project status, and we ask that you provide there's a historic structure report and preservation plan checklist. We provided a link to the Historic Preservation Office guide to preparing HSRs and preservation plans. Any HSR and preservation plan that we fund needs to meet the requirements, the guidelines for their completion based on that HPO document, those guidelines. So I think it's important that you and your consultant sit down and kind of go through that document, go through the checklist, so that you're both aware of what we're expecting if you do come into us for a preservation plan or HSR. Again, we do provide a link to those guidelines in the application and our guidelines themselves. So anyway, here we're asking you again, with regards to what the project concept is, to check off all the various aspects that might apply to this project. Next, please. So your project budget. Again, Haley mentioned earlier that for HSM and Heritage Tourism grants, grants range from $5,000 to $50,000. The trust will provide up to 75% of that total project cost, up to $50,000. So if you are requesting $50,000, that means that your total project budget is at least $66,670, which again, our $50,000 plus your $16,670 totals the 75-25% match. Again, in this section, you'll provide your actual grant request, what the amount is. We'll ask you what your minimum match is, what that 25% match is. And then sometimes some of these projects go over that amount. So again, if it's more than a $66,000 project, tell us how you're gonna, where you're gonna get your match in order to complete that project, since the 25-75% won't necessarily cover the full cost. We're also asking you in this section and within attachment E of the attachment section to document the match in hand. For nonprofits, you basically be providing account statements showing either funding in accounts, or if you've gotten grants from, say, a county preservation program, or you've gotten federal money, we like to see those commitment letters saying that you have received a certain amount, so we know that you do have that match in hand. Again, and if you don't have match in hand, there's an opportunity to provide how you plan on raising that match in order to make sure the project moves forward. Now, if you're a county or municipal government body, again, we're asking you for that resolution that commits specific matching funds, so that if you do get the grant, you are committing that certain amount of funds up front, so that we know that again, the project can move forward if you do get our grant. There are certain, I guess, costs that are not eligible as matching funds. No other corporate business tax funds can be used as your match. The one exception is basically DEP, because that's their only source of funding. But otherwise, you cannot use other corporate business tax funds as your match. No line item appropriations. If you're in the state budget as a line item appropriation, you cannot use that as your match. And no in-kind services either can be used as your match. Next slide, please. So the next section of the application deals with the organizational ability. Here we're asking you about your staff, your board, volunteers, your mission. If you're a nonprofit, we're asking you for your operating budget, provide your balance sheet for last year, as well as your year-to-date balance sheet. We ask you to explain your experience managing grants before, experience working with other consultants. dealing with cyclical maintenance. I mean, do you have a budget for doing maintenance? Is there someone assigned to do maintenance on your property? Again, we're looking at the stewardship, your stewardship capabilities with regard to your historic resource. There's a question dealing with climate change. This question is not just for those coastal resources, it's applicable to all resources. From a flooding standpoint, even if you're near a river or stream, that could happen. But if there's lots of trees surrounding your resource, you might be susceptible to strong winds that could cause damage as well. So we're also looking at just other types of extreme weather conditions and events. So how are you making your resource better prepared to deal with these severe events? Again, Haley mentioned the impact of COVID-19 on your organization. Again, just from an organization standpoint, what have you done over the past year, to deal with this pandemic? We also ask in this section to let us know if you or members of your organization have dealt with any continuing education work, whether it's a best practices workshop, whether it's attending one of the preservation conferences in the past, commission training through the Historic Preservation Office. Rutgers March in Camden also offers continuing ed credits in preservation, or other professional credits. Again, we're just asking you to let us know if you or members of our organization have gone through any of these professional development. Next, please. So the next section deals with public access and benefit. And again, Haley mentioned that we ask you for regular open hours, annual visitation, entry fees. We're looking again at pre-COVID numbers for this because, again, many sites last year weren't open at all, but also tell us, I mean, perhaps you've also done stuff where you've done virtual tours and other things. So between this question and the other question, organizational ability, address how you've handled some pre-COVID stuff. But when it comes to actual numbers of visitation and hours, we're looking at the pre-COVID numbers for that. We're also looking at anticipated community benefit. So accessibility, what kind of interpretation do you do at the site? Have you increased visitation? How do you plan on increasing visitation, if at all? And how are you planning for future capital work at the site? Whether it's ADA accessibility or other forms. Also proposals that we're also looking at, I guess, how you link into other state or national heritage areas, certified local governments, scenic byways, federal state heritage areas. Like I said, we've included links within the application actually and guidelines that link you to these state and national heritage areas. So go through those to make sure to see if you are part of that or not, if you don't know already. Also, Journey Through Jersey. Are you registered through Journey Through Jersey with your site? Okay, next, please. And again, then also we have the special initiatives for 2021, both the underrepresented histories, as well as the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. Again, we're asking you to say, basically what your resource has, how your resource has a direct link to either of these initiatives. This gives you an opportunity to spell that out. Okay. Next, please. So we mentioned earlier applicant assurances. Again, these are both governing body resolutions as well as other forms that need either the applicant or the owner to sign on for. So with the governing body resolution, again, this authorizes and designates a single person who could sign the application assurances pages. So that's linked between the governing body resolution and who's signing the applicant assurances. So that's who's being notified, signified on that resolution. The applicant assurances is signed by that authorizing representative. And it also assures that the matching funds are or will be available if you receive the grant. Owner assurances, again, if the applicant and owner are the same, applicant assurances is enough. If it is different, then you do need the owner of the property to sign the owner assurances for each property that's included in the proposal. Again, if it's one of these MPP projects, where it's a historic district nomination, a survey, architectural survey, or preservation ordinance, then the owner assurances form must be signed by the municipal head And again, if it crosses multiple municipalities, then you need multiple owner assurances, but if it's just within one, then that the head of that municipality, county, whatever the project is, needs to sign that owner assurances page. As Haley mentioned, getting the resolutions sooner rather than later, because it does take time to get them on their agenda. But again, if it misses our grant deadline because you're still waiting for them to meet, provide a placeholder in your application, saying that the board is going to meet on such and such a date, and then you'll be providing us with that resolution after that. But remember that again, everything, whether it's a COE or whatever, needs to be done before August 2nd. Okay, let's move on. So I mentioned earlier, I mean, the applications between Heritage Tourism and HSMs are pretty much the same, but there are some aspects of the Heritage Tourism that are unique only to the Heritage Tourism application. So let's talk a little bit about that. Next, please. Mainly, let's start with eligible activities. These are activities that we consider Heritage Tourism activities. Visitor readiness assessments, visitor evaluation or development of performance evaluation measures at your site, interpretive planning for one or multiple sites, or development and enhancement of linkages between those historic sites, the design and fabrication of interpretive signage or literature. We're not just looking to replace existing brochures that you've run out of. In this case, we're looking, for new designs and fabrication, for both signage as well as brochures in this case. Also doing marketing plans or studies, the design and fabrication actually of that marketing material, training and workshops that create, foster, enhance linkages between sites. I think we see this more as, basically hiring someone to come to talk to you, or actually multiple sites, as far as ways to do heritage tourism linkages between the sites. So it's bringing multiple sites together in order to get these trainings done. Again, if there's something that you're thinking of doing that's not on this list or on our HSM list, reach out to trust staff members and we could discuss to make sure that is an eligible activity or not. Next, please. Okay, some specific or unique aspects to the heritage tourism application itself. Again, property information and historic significance. Again, you need at least one resource in the project, in the project that must be either listed or certified eligible for listing in the New Jersey or National Register of Historic Places, either individually or as contributing to a historic district. But then again, if it's multiple properties, choose a reference property that your project for, and you'll have a place again to list the other properties in the application, but choose one as a reference property that again does meet that criteria of either being listed or being eligible for listing. There's no direct ownership or lease requirements for this, but again, if you do not own the property, you still need to get the owner assurances page signed and submitted, demonstrating that they support the project. Project concept and team. Again, we're asking that you look to see if the project is consistent with the New Jersey Heritage Tourism Master Plan. We provide a link to that. And does it link to a broader regional heritage tourism initiative? So we're asking you to address those questions in the heritage tourism application. And also with public access and benefit, again, is your site visitor ready? Do you have bathrooms, parking areas, and the like? And if so, if you are visitor ready, then we ask in attachment G to kind of go through how you think that you are visitor ready. All right. I think that ends my presentation. So again, remember, Sam's going to go through the attachments aspect in more detail. But at this point, I don't know, I see we do have some questions.
Yeah, we have several questions. So Michael asks, will HSM funds, will it fund HABs drawings and submissions to appropriate federal agencies?
HABs and hair reconstruction projects are eligible under our planning grants. Yeah, HSM grants do fund that.
Great. So Dolly is asking, she's with the Mount Peace Cemetery Association, and she was planning to apply for an HSM grant, but wanted to include the Underrepresented History Special Initiative. How does she incorporate that into her application? And Sam wanted to answer that one live.
Go ahead, Sam.
Sure. So the Underrepresented History Special Initiative, as well as the, well, less so the 250th, but really any application can demonstrate that they should be considered under this special initiative. So there is a question in the application about that, where you should be prepared to explain how you meet the special initiative, and then you know, you can include any documents to back that up in the attachments section, which we'll go over later.
Great.
Yeah, so within both the application as well as the attachment, you know, gives you an opportunity to say how, you know, you directly, you know, meet that initiative.
That's right.
Perfect. And then Paul, I think Paul Muir is just asking for clarification on whether or not in-kind donations such as construction materials, paint, stain, can be used as match, or does it have to be cash?
The quick answer is it has to be cash. I mean, one thing for planning grants, you know, those are construction activities, you know, materials and stuff like that. So that wouldn't count anyway because it's not part of a planning exercise. But no, we're basically what you're going to be showing us. If you do get a grant, you're going to be providing us with invoices and canceled checks showing that things were paid out. So it actually has to be, you know, stuff that was paid out to people. You can't use in-kind or donated services.
Right. And then Michael is asking what the current state rules are for having to go out to public bid for capital projects.
Well, I'm assuming Erin's going to probably touch on that when she goes over capital applications. So maybe we should wait on that. If not, then we'll get there at the end. Great.
Can two organizations apply together for one heritage tourism grant?
Yeah, there could be co-applicants. The application does allow for co-applicants to apply. So yes.
Right, right. And then we sort of answered Jack, but Jack Gordon has emergency repair work to the roof and interior of his organization, his historic house, and he's thinking that the repairs are going to be done long before the grant round is determined or distributed. He's asking will it be eligible for reimbursement when the grants are awarded if all of the work is already done?
Again, that's a capital question that I'm almost positive Erin's going to get into when she goes through her capital application stuff. I mean, let's wait on that because I think it'll be answered when Erin goes through hers.
Okay. And Jack, I hope you can see that, but Sam did address your question more directly. And then Sam wanted this next question answered live. It's from Mark. He's working on a grant of historical markers for the Monmouth County portion of the Great Lenape-Minisink Trail that goes from the Jersey Shore to the Water Gap. Does the underrepresented history require a listing in NJ Register of Historic Places? We contacted them a year ago, and they have some questions about that. Sam.
Okay, I wasn't sure if Glenn was going to jump in. So you will need to be listed or certified eligible for any project that applies for our grant funds, whether it meets our special initiatives or not. There are no eligibility requirements for our program that are waived through the special initiatives. That being said, you know, I think if your trail itself isn't necessarily listable as a resource, you might think about sites along the trail that are already listed or might be eligible for listing. You could undertake that yourself or potentially partner with any of the organizations that are stewarding those specific sites. I don't know.
Just to add on to that, Sam. Yeah, as long as you have at least one site that's either listed or been determined eligible for listing, use that as your relevant property within the HSM application, and then it could go beyond that with your other markers, even if it's not technically listed yet. So, yeah.
Great. That's it for now. We can go to the next section.
Okay, so my name is Erin Fredrickson. I'm a historic preservation specialist with the Trust, and I am going to be talking about capital preservation grants today. Just a heads up, a lot of the information here is going to sound redundant. If you hit a point where you think, I swear I've heard this before, you probably have. We think that's a good thing because we know how long this workshop gets. But there are some key differences between the way that capital preservation grants work and our HSM grants work. So if you are thinking you're going the capital route this year, even if it's in addition to some other options, I encourage you to stick around and listen to how this works out. So when we talk about capital preservation grants, we're really talking about bricks and mortar work. So work like that can consider, we would include preservation, restoration, rehabilitation. We'd also consider things like ADA accessibility, barrier-free access. We have hit this home, I think, today, but I will probably say it multiple times in the next couple of minutes. Archaeology counts as a construction activity for sure. So if it's something that you want to include in your project, you are anticipating ground disturbance, or maybe you're just looking to fully understand your resource, we encourage you to include that in your scope. We also do consider reconstruction an option. The one thing to consider with reconstruction projects is that we have a 20% cap. So no more than 20% of your total project budget can be used for reconstruction. Then there's the heavy hitter, new construction. We do fund new construction. I am going to couch this in the fact that the onus will be on you as an applicant to help us understand why the new construction is necessary and how it is a visitor amenity. If you take a look at our grant guidelines, it does specifically request that any new construction qualify as a visitor amenity if it isn't something like an ADA ramp or something like that, something to increase accessibility to your resource. Our capital preservation grants also will cover non-construction costs, so things like architects or consultants fees. These soft costs cannot be more than 25%, or excuse me, 20% of your total project budget. You might also include in your non-construction budget, maybe your architect needs to put together plans or specifications as part of your capital work. You can certainly include that in your budget, but again, just keep an eye on your numbers, do the math to make sure that whatever that non-construction budget is looking like doesn't exceed 20%. Okay, matching funds. This is one of those slides that I encourage you to pay attention because this is very different from the way that our planning grants work. So I should probably start this by saying, and I think I reiterate this again in a slide or two, capital preservation grants are not the same as planning grants in that I think you'll recall that Glenn mentioned reimbursements for planning grants. We give you 80% of your grant award upfront, assuming that you can show us that you've hired a consultant and you've paid them. We do not pay you upfront with your capital preservation grants. You need to spend the money to get the money. That's something that I think is extremely important. But assuming that's okay, there are a couple options here as far as your capital grant could go. If you're requesting between $5,000 and $150,000, your match would be 40% and the trust would cover 60%. If you're requesting between $150,000 and $1 and $750,000, that's the maximum grant award, our match requirements are even. It's a 50-50 match. You supply half and we supply the other half. Glenn mentioned this earlier, but just to drive the point home, the county municipal entities of government cannot use CBT funds as a match. The reason for that being that we get our money from the CBT, so we don't want you matching our money with our money. DEP applicants, that is different. And if you are a DEP applicant and you have questions about that, you are more than welcome to reach out to us and we can talk to you about it. There was some question last year about this, so I'm going to hit it home today. We encourage you as applicants to reach out to your your county to see if there are preservation grants available. There are a number of counties in New Jersey that have open space or historic preservation funds available. And we encourage you to use those as a match for our program. We see it all the time. So definitely take a look and see if that's an option for you. You can also use federal grants as a match. I know we had a question about this in the Q&A a couple minutes ago, or at least it was sort of leading that way. Match expended limitation. So if you have already started work on your project, on your capital preservation project, you might be able to include that as match expended in your application. There are a couple requirements here. First of all, that work needs to have been completed within 2 years of the application date. To drive it home, applications this year are due April 29th, 2021 at 4:00 p.m. So any work completed after April 29th of 2019 could be considered match expended. Those funds need to be considered an integral part of your grant project, and they cannot exceed 25% of your total project budget. I should also add that any work that has been completed needs to meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. That's a very long buzzword that I am going to cover in a second. Trust staff would be reviewing those elements of your project when we come out to meet you on our site visit. We would ask specifically to see what that work looks like just to make sure everything looks okay. If you are including match expended in your project, you will have to supply documentation to us, things like canceled checks and invoices, so we know that the work has been completed and your contractors and consultants have been paid. Okay. This is another one of those items that's a little bit different from planning grants. I know Haley went over a solid amount of this, but just to refresh everyone's memory, capital grant requirements as far as ownership is concerned. You have two options here. You can either own the property outright in fee simple, or you can lease it. If you lease the property, the lease must be long-term. Long-term by our standards is 15 years. That 15-year clock needs to start on the day of the appropriation, which is the day that the governor signs the bill. The other thing that we're looking for in your lease, and we do open your lease and look at it, is to make sure that the lease cannot be revoked at will. If you are one of those applicants, I think this was another Q&A question that popped up, who has a hard time either extending your lease, you work with a state agency that is a little reticent to do so. We designed the owner authorization form basically for you. That is an option for you that is available on our website, and I believe it's linked in our application. Project timetable requirements for our capital grants. A grant agreement must be in place within 18 months from the date of appropriation. Remember, that's the day the governor signs the bill, and he usually signs between January and March of the following year. So the 2021 grant round, we can expect or hope that the funds will be appropriated between January and March of 2022. So that's when that 18-month clock would start. Any capital work must begin within 2 years from the date of appropriation. So just keep that in mind as you are starting to put your schedule together. The last item on this slide, I think, usually yields a bunch of questions. I'm going to try to be as clear as possible, but luckily, Carrie Hogan is our audit queen. She can step up if we have any questions. But something to keep on your radar, if you receive more than $100,000 from state or federal funds or grants in a fiscal year, you will be required to submit an audit. So even if you receive $50,000 from us, if you receive another $50,000 or more from the Department of Housing and Urban Development, someone else, this is something that you will be required to do. Something to hit home here is that those funds are not reimbursable. You cannot include them in your project budget, and we will not reimburse you for them. Okay, so I said a couple slides ago, I used a really long term that you might have heard of, and if you haven't, that's okay, that's what we're here for. All work in your capital grant application must meet the Secretary of the Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties. These are rules handed down from the Secretary of the Interior and the National Park Service that help us as a staff and any preservationist, be it your architect or our friends at the Historic Preservation Office. These are what we use to gauge the appropriateness of your project. They are readily available on the National Park Service's website if you wanted to get lost in a rabbit hole. They are interesting, but they're long. So some reimbursement conditions, if and when you receive a capital grant from us, you will need to supply documentation of your expenses. So invoices and canceled checks, so we know that the work is being done. And before we can reimburse you, you need to have installed a project sign. I'm hoping that you've seen one of our project signs before. They are very large and they have our big, beautiful logo on them. The specifications for that sign are available on our website if you want to take a look. But that does need to be installed before we can write your first check. This is another one of those items that makes people a little nervous. So I'm going to try to make it very simple. And of course, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them. The preservation easement requirement. If you are a government applicant, you don't need to worry about this. Don't worry about it. If you are a nonprofit, this is where you need to pay attention. If you are a nonprofit organization and you are receiving more than $50,000 in capital preservation funds from us, we will record an easement on the work that we are helping to fund. The length of that easement depends on how much you are asking for. You'll see that it's sort of tiered depending on your grant request. Just to sort of clarify or help put your mind at ease, the reason for this easement, or a good amount of the reason for this easement, is that we want to protect our investment. So God forbid we help you replace your roof and in 50 or in 10 years, something happens. We want to be there to provide technical assistance and also just to make sure that whatever work we did fund isn't replaced with a material that might not work or something like that. Trust staff are always available for technical assistance. We are happy to help out whenever we can, but the easement process is definitely one of those moments that we encourage you to pick up the phone and give us a call. Before we can write your last check, if and when you are awarded a preservation grant, and you received more than $50,000 from us, you also need to install one of those proverbial, probably not proverbial, a literal permanent plaque. Here's an example of one. Again, it needs to be installed. It can't just be ordered. We approve the language on it. We have draft language available in our grant manual, but we'll get to that later on. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the application. Again, a lot of this has been covered previously. There are some items that are a little bit different from the way that our other grant programs operate, but I will call those out specifically. So you will be required to supply your information as an applicant. Tell us who your organization is and give us a project contact. Glenn mentioned this, but I will just repeat it because it bears repeating. Your project contact is someone who I can email in May when I am ready to come see your resource in person, and they will get back to me. They should also be someone who is well-versed in what you are looking to accomplish at your resource. If you are a nonprofit applicant, again, this is something Glenn went over, you need to supply an IRS letter to document your tax exempt status. And you also need to supply your charity registration number. As Glenn mentioned, you are more than welcome to go to the Division of Consumer Affairs website. They have a lookup tool for charity registration numbers. If you are wondering if you're compliant or you're not compliant, that is the place to check. If you are wondering if you are registered or not registered, that is the place to check. If you know you are not registered, we encourage you to reach out to that office as soon as possible. They are one of those offices that has been hit particularly hard during the pandemic, and I know that their lead times are a little bit longer than usual. If you are a government entity, you will need to supply a resolution authorizing the application and the exact amount of matching funds. So your resolution has to do two things, just to reiterate. Okay, so we're really getting into the application now. Give us a project title and summary of your project. Give us a brief description of your project goals and the impact that you hope this project has on your resource. If you want to scroll through our 2021 grant guidelines and take a look at our eligible activities to make sure that what you're proposing is an eligible activity, you can refer to them in your project description. And then you'll also be supplying a budget overview. So fill us in on your grant request. To reiterate, if you are requesting between $5,000 and $150,000, you are a level 1 capital grant applicant. If you are requesting between $150,001 and $750,000, you are a capital level 2 applicant. If you are one of our multi-phase grant applicants, you have a large scale project that will take you at least 2 phases to complete. And each of those phases needs to have a grant request of at least $500,000, but not to exceed $750,000. That means that each phase is at least $1 million. This is also where you would fill us in on your total project budget. So this is no different from the planning, the heritage tourism section. We review your capital applications on exactly the same things. So the historic significance of your resource, your project concept and team, project budget, organizational ability, and public access and benefit. When we talk about historic significance and the name of your resource, we encourage you to use the name that is provided on the National Register or the New Jersey Register nomination, or the name that the Historic Preservation Office uses. And this is also where you fill us in on the status, the register status of your resource. If you're applying for capital funds, your resource needs to be listed on the New Jersey Register before we can write you a check. You don't need to be listed to apply, but the onus will be on you to help us understand how you will list your resource by the time work really begins and you're ready to reimburse. To reiterate, your resource is either New Jersey or National Register listed. It is listed individually or it contributes to a district. Keep in mind, you'll have to go through your nomination to confirm that you are a contributing resource. And if you can't suss it out from there, you might have to reach out to the HPO. You can also be certified eligible, like we've said before. If you are not certified eligible, you have a brand new historic resource that's very exciting. We love to see that, but we encourage you to reach out to the HPO as soon as possible. Every year, Andrea Tingy at the HPO receives a flood of requests about this. So the sooner you start, the better. Historic significance. I made this joke last year. It's not really a joke. And if it is, it's a bad one. But you are in this section, you have the unique opportunity to explain to a bunch of history nerds why your resource is historic. We eat this up. We love this. Not to say we want you to wax poetic. We read upwards, or our evaluators read upward of 60 applications. So keep that in mind. We can't stress how important it is to be concise, but tell us about your resource. Is it significant because it's an excellent example of Greek Revival architecture? Did someone famous live there? There are a million different ways You'd also fill us in on the use history and also the current condition. So is it full of asbestos and no one can go inside? Is it doing just fine? Or threats to the resource. So I think we've really hit this home during this workshop, but another example here would be maybe you live in a municipality where development pressure is very high, and if we don't get funding now, maybe we run the risk of demolition. So, all right, project concept and team. Fill us in on your project overview. Are you applying for a standalone project, or are you applying for funds that will, a project in which our funding will contribute to a much larger, project? So in other words, are you coming to us to replace your roof and that's all you need? Or are you coming to us to replace your roof, but over here you've got people working on replacing your windows, doing some archaeology, the whole nine? If that is the case, if you have a larger project, that's totally fine. But keep in mind that trust staff do have purview over the whole project and not just what you're requesting funds for. The reason for this is that we want to make sure that the whole project meets the standards. It doesn't make sense for us to fund an element of a project that is good preservation practice, while something over here that we wouldn't necessarily agree with is going on. So just fill us in. Project overview is also where you would talk about whether or not you are a multi-phase applicant. Multi-phase projects, your overview really needs to suss out your phases, and your application will also need to help us understand why you have phased the work the way that you have. Project specific, so is this just interior or exterior work? What treatment approach are you using? And what non-construction activities are you including? So your architect is charging you a fee, and you also need to, you need them to write up a conditions assessment. That's fine, it just can't exceed 20%. Project substantiation. These are planning documents that substantiate the proposed capital project. We love to see this. Our evaluators love to see it. If you have already come to us for a planning grant, for a preservation plan or an HSR, attach that document and then point to where in that document you can say, we've done XYZ, the first 3 things on our list of priorities. We're coming to the trust for the 4th item on our list. Even if we didn't fund the preservation plan or the HSR, that's fine. Just fill us in and send us any documents that help to inform why this is the correct project for your resource at this time. We say that a lot at the trust. This is where you can really showcase the work that you've completed on your site. All right, project concept and team continued. You will need to supply a scope statement. This can be something that maybe your architect writes up for you or whoever you have working on your project. Something new for this year is our capital scope of work form. This form is divided by construction divisions. What we expect you or your architect, if you have one on retainer, to do is basically break apart your project into construction divisions and write out the scope for us. There are a couple reasons that we have implemented this year. The number one reason is because it really does help us to better understand what you understand your scope to be. It helps our evaluators understand what the scope is supposed to be. And when we compare these documents with the capital budget worksheet, we can confirm that we're all on the same page. I'm going to talk about that budget worksheet a little more, I think in the next slide, maybe in 2 slides. This is also where you tell us about your current project status. So have you received proposals or selected proposals? Have you only received cost estimates? Do you have someone hired and you are ready to go? If you have an architect, you're basically ready to go. As soon as you hear from us that you're getting funding, you're getting started. Your architect will need to pre-qualify your contractors. We can talk a little bit more about that if you have questions. We are always happy to talk about that. But that's sort of where those bids go out to play a little bit. This is also where you fill us in on your project timetable. Again, we have we have our own timetable. Need to make sure that work is done within a certain amount of time. You know, do you plan to break ground immediately? Are you breaking ground on April 30th? Or are you going to wait until you hear from us? You are more than welcome to begin work on April 29th at 4:01 p.m. That is totally fine. Keep in mind that the risk that you run is that you might not get funded. So if you are completely dependent on our funding, we encourage you to wait a couple more months. We know it's agonizing. We're working hard to try to make this happen for you, but you will have to wait. Here's that archaeological considerations thing. And by now, maybe you're ready for me to stop talking about this, but I can't stress this enough. If you are proposing any level of ground disturbance at your resource, we are going to ask you about the archaeology. You can be digging a trench for a new phone line, and we will ask you about the archaeology. We encourage you to consider this up front. If you aren't proposing ground disturbance as part of this capital project, that's fine. We're not going to ask you about it, but it is something that we encourage all of our applicants to consider at some point or another. An archaeological management plan is certainly an eligible expense if you are looking to determine the long-term impacts. You know, if you're looking at capital work down the line, something you'll have to think about eventually. Project budget. This is where you'll talk to us about your grant request, your minimum match requirement versus the match required to complete your project. Sometimes these numbers are different. It depends on each project. You will have to document your match in hand. That is not to say that you can't apply if you don't have your matching funds. It's something that we look at, and we hope that you will have your match in hand as soon as possible. But if you don't, you will need to help us understand how you plan to get those funds, at least by the time you plan to start work. If you are excellent fundraisers, you have you've demonstrated experience in the ability to fundraise and complete incredible capital campaigns, please include that in your attachments. We love to see that. If you're a nonprofit, you will need to supply account statements or funding commitments. When you supply account statements, please redact any sensitive information. Governing body resolutions will be required for any governing body or government entities, county municipal entities. Those resolutions need to commit the specific matching funds that are required to complete your project. Documenting match expended. Again, this is only for those of you who plan to include work that you have completed in the last 2 years in your grant application as match. Again, that work cannot exceed 25% of your total project budget, and it needs to have been completed within 2 years of the date of application. So between April 29th, 2019 and April 29th of 2021. There is an entire attachment where you can fill in all the information we'll be looking for there, signed contracts, invoices, proof of payment, and before and after photos. Okay, this is our capital budget worksheet. This is the item that I referenced a couple slides ago. This is a spreadsheet that includes that basically asks you to break out your project and those costs by construction division. So that scope of work worksheet asks you to break out your project by construction division, but to provide a written scope of work. This asks you for the funding or the amount of money that you are expecting for each construction division. The idea is that if I hold up your scope of work worksheet and your capital budget worksheet, if I look across and see that there is something in Division 3 concrete, you are laying a new foundation, I should see a number in Division 3 on your capital budget worksheet. So This again helps us to make sure that something isn't getting lost in translation. We know, if we look at your budget worksheet, it really helps us, and actually our evaluators who really look into this stuff, helps us gauge what part or what construction division is going to eat up the most of your resources. It really helps us to figure out like where the money is really going. So your budget worksheet would be included in attachment E. If you are a multi-phase applicant, you need to submit one of these capital budget worksheets for each phase and also for the entire project. So if your proposed project is 2 phases, you'll be submitting 3 worksheets. Organizational ability, hang tight with me guys. I know this is getting very long, but we're almost there. This is very similar. I mean, honestly, it's exactly the same as Glenn went over earlier. Talk to us about your staff. If you have staff, your board, if you have volunteers. Some of our applicant organizations have incredible volunteer resources. It's unbelievable. Tell us about it. We want to see that. If you're a nonprofit, you will need to supply your operating budget. Tell us about your experience managing grants and working with consultants. If you don't have experience, that's okay. If you do have experience, we want to see what that is. Attach your cyclical maintenance plan. This is something that goes to basically just shows us that you are excellent stewards, that you have an idea of what your building requires on an annual basis. And this is where you'd also tell us how COVID has impacted your organization. You can also answer a couple questions to let us know what kind of continuing education and professional development opportunities your staff or your board or your volunteers have taken. Here are some examples, but they certainly aren't limited to these options. Public access and benefit, again, very similar to or identical to what Glenn spelled out in his planning section. Let us know if you have regular open hours. Let us know if your building is so deteriorated that people can't go inside. If that is the case, will our funding help you to open your resource or at least get you on the way there? Tell us how many people come to visit your resource on an annual basis. If you measure that, if you actually have someone there counting how many people come to your open houses, use that. If you have to give us a guesstimate, that's fine. Again, this is pre-COVID. We are not in the business of docking anyone for not being able to host tours right now. We completely understand. So go ahead and wow us with the numbers that you had before March of last year. Anticipated community benefit. This is a really good section. Tell us how our funding and how your project, the work that you've put into this, will change things moving forward for you. Will it increase accessibility physically to your resource? Will it allow you to interpret a new, something new, a history that maybe you weren't aware of before or was kind of overlooked previously? Will more people come to visit your resource? We love to see that kind of stuff. This is also that section where we talk about state heritage initiatives. The one thing I want to note here is that we link to each initiative in our application. So if you're looking at this and you're thinking, I don't know if I'm on the Coastal Byway State Heritage Trail, there is a link there. You can pull it up. We want you to get all the credit you are entitled to. So please take a look. Journey Through Jersey. If you are an eligible resource, we encourage you to apply, to nominate yourself. That's another one that isn't included in these state heritage initiatives. I'm not going to hit this home too much because we've covered it, but again, our special initiatives are our underrepresented histories and the 250th of the American Revolution. I think it is easy for applicants to or I can see how it would be easy for applicants to think, well, how is capital work really going to answer this question? Our fact sheet actually has an example that I think is a really good one. Ringwood Manor up in Passaic County applied last year before the special initiative was available or even thought up, to be honest. But they applied to replace the roof on their carriage barn. And once the building envelope is sealed up, they intend to use the carriage barn to hold exhibits and interpret the Native American history that is available up in that area of New Jersey. They will also use the space to talk about the people who worked at Ringwood Manor, who were not necessarily wealthy white landowners. And they will also use that space to discuss the role of Sally Cooper Hewitt, who is actually, oh, I hope Sue Schutte isn't on this call because she might correct me, which is fine. They believe an anti-suffragist. So something interesting to keep in the back of your mind. That fact sheet, I think, will help get your mind going if you're not quite sure how you can apply this. This is my last slide. So if you are still here, great job. We are so close to being done. Again, the applicant assurance is identical to how Glenn spelled it out. Your governing body resolution must authorize and designate a single person to sign your applicant assurances. Your applicant assurances is signed by the person named in your governing body resolution. So if your governing body resolution authorizes Beyonce, had to make sure you're paying attention, to sign your applicant assurances, we will open your applicant assurances and check to make sure Beyonce signed that document. We will also probably call you to see if we can meet Beyonce. It's neither here nor there. Oh, and Beyonce would need to be on your governing body. Anyway, I'm getting carried away. The owner assurances is only required if the owner is not the applicant. If the owner and the applicant are the same, all you need to submit is the applicant assurances. The applicant assurances is required for everyone. The owner assurances is only signed by the property owner of each property included in the proposal. So with that, I see that there are questions. So let's see what we've got.
Okay, none of the questions are from Beyonce though.
Oh, I invited her.
Nicholas asks, must the audits be an external audit conducted by a CPA, or can they be internal audits conducted by the corporate board? And I'll go ahead and answer that. It has to be an external audit by an outside CPA or firm who will then come in and perform the audit. I just want to note also that audit expenses are not reimbursable expenses from the trust. So please build the cost of them into your own budget, knowing that you'll have to pay for that. And as it was mentioned, the audit requirements are anything over $100,000. So bear that in mind. But yes, it does have to be from an outside firm. And then Sue, sort of adjacent to that, is an audit of the organization finances or a trust project? And the answer is that it depends on how much money you get. If it's less than if it's under 750,000, which most of you are, then you can do you have to do a yellow book audit, or you can do a program specific audit. But the higher you get, the more it makes sense to just get an organizational financial audit and have a section that explicitly pertains to the trust funds that you received and the program that you organized to get those funds. So hopefully I answered both of those. And then Michael asks, is there flexibility with the Secretary of Interior standard requirements that can be discussed with the trust for a determination for a specific restoration project? And Glenn, you want to answer that? Is there flexibility? Or Aaron, you want to answer that?
Oh,
Flexibility?
please, Glenn, by all means, Glenn.
I'm sorry, Aaron, I skipped. Go ahead.
The short answer is it needs to meet the Secretary of Interior standards. I mean, it has to meet the standards. The standards themselves do allow for some flexibility between what's preservation, restoration, rehabilitation. So there's flexibility worked into it, but it has to meet the standards. No getting around that.
Yes. This one just came through. I haven't had a chance to read it. Will a church currently owned by a New Jersey 501c3 organization and in no way associated with a religious organization be eligible for an HSM grant?
I don't see why not.
Right. I mean, for HSM, I mean, there's a difference between construction and HSM when it comes to religious institutions. We can't fund, what the Supreme Court said is that we can't fund improvement or repairs to houses of worship. So a capital repair to a current house of worship. I mean, if it's no longer being used as a house of worship, then it's no longer considered a church. It's a building that had a former history, but so I hope that answers it.
And then there's a question from Michelle. Are there insurance requirements once a capital project is completed?
Yes, there are. And of course, I have a bunch of insurance certificates sitting on my desk at the office that I could point to, but there are requirements for comprehensive liability. If you have a car, you should have automobile insurance, workers' comp if you have employees, and we would need to be listed as an additional insured. You would supply a certificate of insurance to us if and when you are awarded as part of your info packet. So
just to add to that is, I mean, we need that for if you received a grant during the grant process, but also if you have a preservation easement as a condition of the grant, then that insurance will have to continue during the easement period as well.
Okay, great. Let's see. Judy has a couple of questions. I think the gist of it is, is it the order of operation? I'm missing one of the questions. I have two of the three parts of the questions, but Sam, you wanted to answer this live, so go ahead.
Oh, sorry, I just marked it to answer live. I think the gist of the question is, when can work begin, and should they wait till after the deadline to start work? This is a capital project.
Sure. So again, you are welcome to begin work after you have applied. So after April 29th, the one risk that you take is that you might not be funded. So if you are really, if this project won't move forward unless you receive a grant from us, given the competitive nature of our grant program, we can't tell you yes or no, but you have the option to begin April 29th, or you can wait. It's kind of up to you.
I also want to add to that is that any work that you do prior to getting the grant still needs to meet the Secretary of Interior standards. And again, you run the risk if you proceed without being under our grant, without anyone giving oversight. If you then come to us when you get the grant, we might say, wait, this doesn't meet the standards and we can't reimburse that. So that's the other risk of if you're able to start sooner. And yeah, that's it.
Yep.
Michael is asking again, what is the current state rules for having to go out to public bid for capital projects?
Glenn, can I hand this one off to you? I don't want to confuse anyone.
Well, I'm more than happy to confuse people. So the trust, if our money is going to a nonprofit, you do not need to do prevailing wage and that sort of stuff. If the resource is owned by the state, by a municipality or a county, they need to follow prevailing wage. We require that all work contracted, that your contractors are pre-qualified to make sure that they do meet qualification standards. And if it is a municipal or county government, there's additional requirements that local government services require you as far as having a public hearing on what that criteria is as far as pre-qualification. I hope I hit everything there.
I think so. Let's see, Haley would like to answer the question from Sherry of if she was denied funding last year, can they revisit the reviewer's notes?
Right. So any of our return applicants that did not receive funding last year, in your letter notifying you that you weren't recommended for funding, we do highly, highly, highly recommend that you reach out to your reviewing PO, and we can give you kind of a debrief on exactly what the evaluators said during that meeting. They can give you some tips on how to improve your application for this year, things that worked well, things that didn't work well. So absolutely, that should be the first thing you do before you start your new submission.
Great. Let's see. I think that's it.
All
We
right.
can
Well,
move on to attachments.
with that, yeah, I'll pass it off to Sam to talk about attachments.
All right, thank you, Erin. I hope we didn't give folks too much false hope that we were at the end of the presentation. We do have one short section left, but I will tell you, if you stick with us to the end, we will be providing some suggestions for how to set your application apart in this highly competitive program. So it really is worth sticking with us. I see we still have over 100 people holding out, so we appreciate that. We've thrown a lot of information at you already, but there's some more crucial information to come, and some of it should be sort of repetitive from the earlier section, so that should be helpful. So feel free to get up and do some stretches if you need to get the blood moving, because we are in the home stretch. Yeah, our attachments can feel a little daunting for first-time applicants, but there are a number of resources available to walk you through the requirements step by step. So we're going to go through that. So in addition to the online application, we require that all of your supporting documents be submitted to us on a USB, which we need to receive by the application deadline. Something important to keep in mind about these USB attachments is that they form a complete package alongside your online application submission. The attachments are broken into lettered sections that were referenced throughout the earlier parts of the presentation. And those sections, they match the application and criteria for review. Essentially, the supporting documents should demonstrate the case that you make for your proposal. So we do not clean up, repackage, or reformat anything that you submit.
Right.
When formatting your USB, you should keep your audience in mind and present as glossy, professional, and complete a product as possible, following our directions very carefully. I'll explain a little bit more about attachment formatting in a moment, but the contents of the USB should be organized by folders, exactly like you see in the screenshot on this slide. Be sure to name the folders using the titles attachment A, attachment B, etc., without any extra wording. We've received some USBs in the past with really lengthy titles, and our computer systems actually had trouble opening the files, and we certainly don't want that. In addition to the appropriately labeled folders, each USB must also have a table of contents file, which I'll explain further in a moment. Again, your USB needs to be received by our office by the April 29th deadline at 4 p.m. in order for your application to be considered complete. While we will accept hand deliveries of the USBs to our office in extenuating circumstances, we ask that everyone do their very best to submit their USB to us through the mail. This is just a common sense safety precaution that we're taking during the COVID-19 pandemic. And it's going to require you to be prepared to send the USB well in advance of our deadline to ensure that we receive it on time. So if you click submit on the online portion of that application right at 3:59 on that application deadline, it's no problem as long as we've received that USB in advance with your supplemental materials. For anyone who's concerned about receipt confirmation with a mail submission, you should know that when we receive your USB in the mail, we are going to send you an email notification right away to let you know that we've received it. I'll now explain the USB table of contents and then shortly explain the attachments in order. Next slide. So the USB table of contents, it should list every document that's included on the USB. It should be organized by attachment type with short, relevant titles. This lets us know which documents you've included and submitted and prevents us from overlooking anything you might have included. With that in mind, please make sure that this document does accurately reflect what you've included on the USB. As was mentioned at the start of the workshop, our website and application materials include a resource that we call the supporting documents checklist. This is going to be really invaluable for helping you determine which documents you need to provide. And the checklists are specific to the type of grant you're applying for. You can also use that supporting documents checklist as a formatting guide so that you know which attachments go under which headings. Now let's get into the attachments themselves. If you'll go to the next slide. So attachment A is all about applicant information. This is where our nonprofit applicants are going to need to include that copy of their IRS determination letter. It's also where all applicants are going to need to include the applicant assurances form, which authorizes the signatory to sign the application, as well as the governing body resolution, which is also required for all applicants. And that form needs to be printed, signed, scanned, and uploaded onto the USB. And you'll see links to the templates for these and all of the other required forms on that supporting documents checklist. Next slide. So attachment B is all about property ownership information. If you as the applicant own the resource, then you don't have to submit any of the documents in this section, as Erin explained. The owner assurance form is required whenever the applicant is not the owner of the property. If you're applying for a municipal planning project or a historic district nomination, you should provide written consent of the mayor of any of the municipalities within the district or community that you're working with. Thankfully, you don't have to include that owner assurance form for every single homeowner. If you're applying for a capital grant and you don't own the resource, there is that additional step, as Erin explained. You need to provide a copy of your lease agreement with the property owner. And if it's for any less than 15 years, you also have to submit the owner authorization form. Next slide. Attachment C is about documenting the historic designation of your resource. So if you're currently individually listed, you need to provide a copy of that entire National Register nomination. Our evaluators and staff really do want to read those nominations, so make sure that you include the full copy. If you are listed as part of a district, and I think Erin explained this pretty well, you should provide the relevant pages of the National Register nomination that list your property as contributing. And again, if that nomination doesn't include your property by name or by address, you'll need to reach out to the State Historic Preservation Office so that they can give you a COE. If you're not listed at all, either individually or as part of a district, you need to submit a certificate of eligibility no later than August 2nd of this year. We'd prefer to have it as part of your USB attachment, but we do have a slightly later due date for that if need be. But if you're in this boat, I definitely encourage you, as Erin did, to reach out to the State Historic Preservation Office as soon as possible regarding eligibility. Their workflow has been really impacted by COVID-19, and that August 2nd deadline is really firm for us. Also remember, as Erin mentioned, for capital grants, even though we can consider your application if you're only certified eligible, you need to actually be listed in the register before we can disperse any funds. Great, next slide. So attachment D deals with the project scope and team, which can get fairly project specific. So we've broken up the slides here by application type. First, we'll talk about attachment D for HSM and heritage tourism applications. Attachment D is where you'll submit your scope statement. So this can be an RFP, it could be a draft RFP, or if you haven't prepared those yet, you could just write a written scope statement that identifies the problem and the approach. Attachment D is also where you'll upload proposals from your consultants, whether or not you've selected one or not. If you've already decided who you want to work with, you also need to include the resumes and credentials of your selected team. They should demonstrate previous work with similar projects and proficiency in the Secretary of the Interior standards, as Erin explained. If you don't have consultant resumes and proposals yet, please detail the required experience your consultant team will need to be able to produce your work product, as well as any proposed fees and cost estimates. Again, if you include an RFP or a draft RFP, it should include these details. As Glenn mentioned, if you're applying for an HSR or a preservation plan, Another document we require is that HSR and preservation plan checklist. Having your consultant fill out this checklist or completing it while you search for a consultant, it's a really helpful tool for us to assess whether the final product will meet the standards, but we also see it as a valuable resource for you to help set expectations with your consultant and ensure that the final product is going to be what you hope it will be. For heritage tourism, attachment D is where you'll include any regional or broader heritage tourism initiatives or plans that your proposed project will be a part of. Finally, if you're applying for an architectural survey, attachment D is where you'll submit a map showing the proposed survey area. So there are a lot of requirements in attachment D, and our evaluators pore over them really thoroughly. So I definitely encourage you to review that supporting documents checklist really carefully. Next slide. So in attachment D for capital grants, really similarly, this is where you'll upload a scope statement. This can be your RFP or any proposals you've received. A new requirement this year, as Erin explained, is that scope of work form for capital projects, where we ask you to break down the individual work items by CSI construction division. Again, attachment D should also include the resumes and credentials of the consultants that you've decided to work with, demonstrating their compliance with the standards. And then you should also include cost estimates and proposed fees for the project. Multi-phase applicants should note that they have to include cost estimates not only for the first phase, but for the entire project. And also attachment D for capital projects should include any planning documents that substantiate the proposed work. This is really important. If you have a preservation plan or a conditions assessment or any other sort of formal planning document for your resource that recommends the work that you're now proposing, you should include this. It shows our evaluators that you are implementing work that was recommended in your planning document. This is also where you would include design documents you may have, such as construction docs, schematic designs, specs, etc. As I mentioned previously, there's a lot in attachment D, so you should really lean heavily on that supporting documents checklist. Right, next slide. So attachment E also varies a bit by project type. So we'll start here with attachment E for HSM and heritage tourism applicants. This is where you'll provide documentation of the match in hand that you have to commit toward the project. As we explained earlier, nonprofits should submit account statements and or letters of funding commitments. Really importantly, you should scrub these materials of any sensitive information, such as bank account numbers. Anything that's submitted to us is potentially accessible through the Open Public Records Act, and we really don't want to be in a position where we're holding on to any of your sensitive information. And then municipal and county governments should include a resolution committing the specific matching funds, as Erin explained. Next slide. So attachment E for capital projects. Capital applicants need to provide the same documentation to demonstrate match in hand, just as I explained. But if you're claiming any match expended, you must also document the work that's been completed. So this should include signed contracts with your contractors and consultants. It should include invoices, proof of payment, before and after photos. And if the property is municipally owned, you need to show us that you've received authorization from the State Historic Preservation Office for that work. All of our capital applicants also need to complete the capital budget worksheet that Erin was talking about. That'll be included in this attachment. And it, again, breaks out the project by CSI construction division. And Erin was saying that the budget lines in that worksheet should match the line items in the scope of work form. This is really important so that we can verify that your budget matches your scope of work. Multi-phase applicants should note that they have a special capital multi-phase budget worksheet that should include the budget for the entire project as a whole, as well as for each individual phase. Right, next slide. Attachment F deals with your organizational ability as a potential grant recipient. So if you have a cyclical maintenance plan for your resource, you should include it here. You should also include the resume and credentials of the project manager and anyone else within your organization who's going to help manage the grant funds. So the grant management team's credentials go in this attachment, while the consultant team's credentials go in attachment D. Nonprofits must also include a current year-to-date budget in the form of a balance sheet, but government applicants do not need to submit a budget. Next slide. So attachment G is my favorite one. It's where you demonstrate the community benefit and community support for your project, as well as how you might meet any of the 2021 special initiatives. As we've mentioned several times throughout this presentation, the letters of support are really important. Our evaluator panel does actually read the letters. They'll notice if they're not there, and they will notice if they're the same template language in every letter. So you should be really thoughtful about the letters you include. We don't want to see only letters from legislators, although those letters are great. We also want to hear from people in the community who use and love your resource. We've also been harping on the deadline. We know that some of the legislator letters do come directly from the legislators to our office. Obviously, you don't have so much control over whether that gets to us by the deadline, but you certainly shouldn't be out there soliciting these letters after the deadline. Other ways to document community support and engagement are to show us your event flyers, your program lists, and any recent press clippings you may have. For municipal planning projects, this is also where you should include any documentation of recent public engagement regarding your project, such as public meeting agendas, sign-in sheets, resolutions passed or adopted, etc. And for heritage tourism, this is where you'll document visitor readiness, as Glenn was explaining. So you should be showing photos or documentation of any of the aspects of visitor readiness that you describe in the application. Next slide. The final attachment is attachment H. This is where you'll include your photos and any other miscellaneous documents. Really importantly, we did increase the photo documentation requirements last year. So any new or returning applicants should note that you are required to submit a photo identification sheet that numbers and labels all of the photos. For HSM and capital applicants, or really anyone with a singular resource that they're focused on, you need to submit photos of each elevation of the building, as well as an overall shot that shows the resource in its context. And then you should also submit detail photos showing any areas that demonstrate your need. There's some great examples of that on the slide here. Heritage tourism and municipal planning project applicants, you should submit photos of the reference property, but also any other significant resources that are within your project boundary or scope. With the photos, as with every element of your application, please remember your audience. Our panel of evaluators is made up of professionals who will not have a chance to see your site in person. They're based out of state primarily. And they won't get to see your site in person. So these photos are really the only chance that you have to show them the resource, and your selection of photos should be thorough enough to give them a good sense of the significance and need of the resource. But they also shouldn't be so overwhelming that they can't realistically look at all the photos. So there is an amount of curation that's going to go into preparing these. Again, attachment H also includes any other miscellaneous documents that don't fit in any of the other headings. And if you include anything like that, it's really important that you label that in the table of contents. Otherwise, we may not even notice that they're there. Next slide. So that covers all of the attachments. If you're one of our newer applicants, this may feel like alphabet soup or the most painful episode of Sesame Street that you've ever imagined. But I promise it's actually quite straightforward. And I highly recommend that you use that supporting documents checklist as a guide. And before we turn to questions about the attachments, I also want to go over some suggestions that we have for how to set your application apart. Our grant program is remarkably competitive, and we want to share how some of the qualities that we've noticed in the strongest applications. So the strongest applications have well-written, concise responses to the application questions. They have a clear, well-defined scope of work that's informed by planning documents. They have strong letters of support, both from elected officials as well as community stakeholders who utilize and cherish the resource. And they have compelling photos that give our evaluators a strong understanding of the resource and its needs. As I've said before, please think about your audience and present a polished and accurate application package. Check your numbers. I think Haley mentioned this, and Erin and Glenn. Check your numbers. Your budget should be accurate in every part of the application, from your written responses to the budget worksheet to the proposals from your consultant. So make sure to start early, download a copy of the online application, keep that supporting documents checklist close by, and double check it before you put your USB in the mail well ahead of that deadline. And most importantly, keep in mind that we will no longer accept supplemental information of any kind during the evaluation process. My colleagues noted some highly specific items that we can accept at later dates if need be, but everything else needs to get to us by that deadline. So if you neglect to include a cyclical maintenance plan in attachment F, we're gonna have to assume that you don't have one. If you neglect to include letters of support from community members in attachment G, we're gonna have to assume that there isn't vocal community support for your project. To have a truly competitive application, the material that we receive by the deadline needs to tell a compelling and complete story. So that covers the attachments and ways to set your application apart. And with that, are there questions about that before we open up to more general questions?
Yeah, we have a couple for you, Sam. So one of them is from kind of the same. So one is from Clark Perks and one is from Linda Barth. The letters of support, should they be addressed to Dorothy Guzzo, to the trust? Should they be addressed to the applicant? What do you recommend in terms of who the letters should be addressed to?
I mean, I'm going to defer to some of the senior staff on this, but as long as it's about your project and it's clear that it's referencing our grant program, I don't think we're going to be too particular about that.
We accept all of them, whether it comes to a named person, to whom it may concern, our chair of the board, to Dorothy, we'll accept all of them. So.
And just a note, you can have the legislative letters of support mailed to the trust office, and we'll take a hard copy and scan it and get it to the evaluators. But if you have those community support letters or even the legislative support letters in hand, include a scan of them with your application. The evaluators read through that USB. We do occasionally have to send them extra information, but we've seen over the last couple of years that what's on the USB is what sticks in their mind when they evaluate your grant. So the more of those letters that can be included with the application attachments at the deadline, the better. However, we would accept copies sent to the office. That's not uncommon.
Great. And then Erin would like to answer the question from Pat. Our county has a preservation grant program that is funded through the county dedicated open space tax, not related to the CBT funds. Can that grant be a part of the match towards this grant?
Yes, absolutely. We encourage you to explore county opportunities, especially if they do not touch CBT funds, which I can't imagine they would, but please look into any sort of county open space, historic preservation funds that might be available to you at the county level.
Yes, yes. Okay. Those are all the questions for that section. Any other, what would you want to say?
I was just going to say, I saw a question in there about what to do if you are an applicant that won't have gone out to bid or released an RFP at the time of application. So you won't have resumes to submit. It's a really important part of our evaluation that you list the credentials that your project team must have. So even if you don't have a resume, in that RFP, you need to say, that they need to meet X, Y, and Z credentials, because when we go to score your application, we want to make sure that we can score it in the same way that we could score an application that comes in with resumes. So if you're not submitting information from a project team that you want to work with, and you're just working off of an RFP, make sure that RFP has all of that required information, especially about the project team.
Great. Okay, nothing else is coming through at the moment. We're opening it up to general questions. So if you have any questions whatsoever, now's your chance. You can also, if you decide that if a question does occur to you and you want to reach out to us, please, oh, my dog. Not reach out to my dog, don't reach out to my dog, but reach out to our info box, and it's on our webpage, and it's njht@dca.nj.gov.
Also, I just wanted to add before we address those last couple of questions, because of the pandemic, we are all working remotely. As you can see, we're all in our homes here. So when you call our office number, we're not there to answer it. So email is going to be the most efficient way to get a hold of us. We do access our voicemail, but if you're hoping to call and catch one of us at our desks, unfortunately, we're not there. So please email us with your questions. It's going to be the quickest way to get you an answer.
And our emails are up right now. Okay, we do have another question coming in. Would an application for a project for a building which is, quote, falling down because of neglect really be ranked higher than a project for a building that has been owned and cared for more than 200 years by the same owner?
Not necessarily. I'll jump on this. I mean, was it your fault? Why it's neglected? Was it neglected and you took it over, so you now trying to fix it up? I mean, there are many different factors that go into that. I mean, and again, looking at threat either from the deterioration or whatever is just one aspect that is being looked at when we look at the overall whole application. So I mean, there's lots of different situations that yes, it could, but maybe not. So it depends on the specific situation that building falls within.
Great. Let's see, we have, okay, here's a question from Michelle. Does the capital grant include acquisition funding? And Erin's gonna answer that.
Our grant program at this time does not allow acquisition of real property, as it is not an eligible activity, unfortunately. So the answer is no.
Okay. And Patty asks, that seems like the application is scaled up for large projects. Is it really available for projects under 10 grand?
They range from 5,000 up to 150 for level ones, and above that is a level 2. So yes, it falls within. It's looked at as a level 1 application for capital grants.
And while it may not seem competitive when you're going up against these big ticket items, I mean, sometimes those smaller grants are kind of an easier yes, because it takes a smaller bite out of our pot of money. So don't be dissuaded by these $750,000 projects you may be competing against, because we fund 5,001 and up. We see them all. So definitely don't think that you're not in the running because you have a smaller project.
And that's one reason why we have level 1 versus level 2 is so that we can look at them more competitively within themselves.
Looks like it's winding down. I don't see any new questions.
It's worth noting for anyone tuned in that the email address on this slide at the bottom of the screen is not quite accurate. We're going to fix that before we put the PowerPoint up on the website. But if you're wondering what our general email inbox is, it's njht@dca.nj.gov.
The one thing I'm going to note, this is a question in our inbox that Sam just answered, but I'm just to reiterate, if you realize that you missed something or you didn't quite get it, we are recording this workshop. We're going to put it up on our YouTube channel, hopefully next week, barring any technical issues. So that will be an option for you. And we will also make a copy of the PDF of this PowerPoint presentation available so that you can scroll through that way too.
And we can't emphasize enough, I mean, please do reach out to any of us or to the general number if you have any questions, because the only time we could address it is before the application. So we want to make sure we're helping you out as much as possible before you submit. So please reach out to us if you have any questions or concerns whatsoever with regarding your project.
Okay, it seems like we're wrapping up now. I want to thank everybody for your patience and sitting in for 2 hours of this. It was very intense. We didn't even have a little chocolate chip cookie break in the middle of it. So again, thank you very much for coming. I want to thank the staff too for hanging in there and doing this. And I know, Erin, are we sending out a little survey after this to see if people like this method?
I think that's a good idea. I can
Okay.
get that worked up.
Okay, so again, good luck, everybody, and we'll hope to be talking to you in the coming months.
Oh.